You're listening to Keith Engle, the host of TGI Sports Talk on the National Streaming Sports Roku channel.
Good morning, everybody. Keith Engle here for TGI Sports Talks one-on-one with Keith Engle. How's everybody doing today? Hope you're having a great Friday, another week down. Been kind of rainy and dreary here in upstate New York for the last few days. I'll have my guest, Larry Schechter, come in here in just a few minutes, the author of The History of Fantasy Sports and also, I believe, How to Win at Fantasy Baseball, if I have that name right. If I don't, I apologize. We'll get Larry to correct that. I want to welcome everybody watching this morning on our TGI Sports Facebook feed, our YouTube feed. We're live as always, as all our shows are, on the National Streaming Sports Roku channel. And remember, all the National Streaming Sports shows are brought to you in part by Bet Us. You can go to Northeast Streaming Sports webpage, nessp.info, and click the link there. And it certainly helps all the shows that air on National Streaming Sports. Bet responsibly, though, guys. Lots of stuff you can bet right now with college football live. You got future bets on World Series, playoffs, to be relevant to baseball. But there's a lot going on. Bet smart. As the saying goes, bet with your head, not over it. And you'll get my college picks later today. And we'll be back later with the MLB update at 3 p.m., by the way. Quick shout out to Ralph Williams at RW Media, who does some great stuff out of Pittsburgh, including the Sports Corner, every Tuesday from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern with Smokin' Jim Frazier. I've been a guest there. It's a good show. To our groups, our top groups. Listen, there's hundreds of groups that allow me to share, and we have partnerships with, and we appreciate all of them. Specifically, the Sports Authorities with John Gonzalez. No better run group than what John does over there. Greg Rawlings at America's Pastime, the Love for Baseball. Greg runs a great site, does some great giveaways and stuff, and this will be relevant to his group for sure today. Let's Talk Sports, Tanner D in the group, get the guys, the Bottom Line Sports guys with Flo and the gang. Great podcast they do over there. And, of course, Ken Krause over at Golf Bud Sports and More. And thumbs up, DDH. I know you're watching us today. We'll have Larry in here right real quick. We're going to talk about the history of fantasy baseball and see where that kind of what roads that leads to, as it always does. And you guys are welcome to ask questions as we go along, and we'll certainly get to them if they're relevant at that point in time. And I'll say a quick good morning to David Guyette and a quick good morning to Carlton. How you doing, Carlton? Good to have you with us this morning. And with no further ado, I'll bring in my guest this morning, Mr. Larry Schechter. Good morning, Larry.
Good morning, Keith.
Great to have you with me this morning. I know, how's the weather in Florida? I didn't even think to ask. Are you near the hurricane? Jeez, I'm up here like all thinking about my bad weather. How's the weather there?
Well, I'm in Boca Raton, which is in southern Florida, and we avoided the hurricane.
Altogether.
We just got a little bit of wind and rain. But yeah, if the hurricane was anywhere near here, I would not be here. I'd be talking to you from a hotel somewhere or something. I would evacuate.
Fair enough. And I'll tell any of our listeners, I meant to mention this at the top, stay safe. You got no choice right now but to hunker down. Stay safe if you're in the path of this hurricane. I haven't heard anything this morning, so hopefully it is losing some steam. But Larry, I appreciate you coming in. The book that we talked about at the top was The History of Fantasy Sports. You can certainly go, guys. I do have, let me just see if I have this still. I put the link in, I want to put it in the comments, but I think I lost it. I'll put it back in the comments later. It's also in the description to the show, guys. When you go watch the show, go to the description of the show, and you'll see the link to this. It's The History of Fantasy Sports. And when you go there, I do think you'll see Larry's other book as well, which is, I think, How to Win at Fantasy Baseball. I got that right?
But it's Winning Fantasy Baseball. Yeah, if you go, if you go to Amazon, the easiest thing. If you go to Amazon and type in go to Amazon, type in the History of Fantasy Sports, you'll find it.
Yeah, you'll get both books.
The first book was 2004.
Get that book as well. But I found, and I've only, as I told Larry when we were talking before, I've only had a chance to kind of skim his book because I found it late. And and put it on my Kindle and got through a little bit of it the last few nights. And but we're going to learn a lot more today. Larry, you grew up in our discussions, I found out, very near where I am here in upstate New York, in Schenectady, New York. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing and your introduction to baseball in general.
Well, I was born and raised in Schenectady on Wright Avenue near Central Park, if anybody knows where that is. And I grew up there. I went to Boston University. I stayed in Boston till I was about 31, 32, moved back to Schenectady, which was a real surprise because when I left for college, I never in a million years thought I would move back to Schenectady later, but I did. And I was in Niskayuna, and I was in Rexford for several years. And I went to Florida I've been here in Florida about 9 years, roughly. My baseball, I played Little League. I like baseball immediately. I played Little League. I sucked at Little League. My last year of Little League, I had 1 hit and 14 at bats. So the bloop single over the first baseman's head. Paul Franco, if you're out there somewhere listening to this, he was playing first base. He was my friend. I hit it over his head. My only hit in Little League. I also got thrown out of a game. I was one of the only people probably ever got thrown out of a Little League game. My dad was an optometrist, and there was a call the umpire made that we didn't like. And I'm just on my way out to first base. I walked behind the umpire. I said, "You should see my dad. He's an optometrist." And I continued walking to first base, and I felt this hand on my shoulder. The umpire grabbed me by the collar, and he marched me back to my dugout and told my coach I was out of the game.
That's too funny. You say you're the only guy thrown out. You're probably the only guy thrown out kind of in our generation, but I think today kids and parents are getting thrown out of games right and left from what I can see on social media. So it's gotten a little crazy.
That's probably true.
It's just bad behavior at games is ridiculous. That's another whole show, for crying out loud. When you were a kid,
was a long time ago.
Yeah. So as you became a baseball fan, I mean, who were your teams? How did you get, were you rooting for the local teams? Were you outside the box?
I was outside. Well, I started outside the box. I mean, as everybody in that area probably knows, and, in upstate New York like that, it's probably like about maybe 33% Red Sox, 67% Yankees. Does that sound about right still? That's my memory for like 50 years ago.
You got some Met fans, but that's probably close.
But I was definitely outside the box. And what happened is when I was like 10 years old or whatever, I started to get a little bit interested in baseball. I have an older brother, and I asked him, "Who's the best baseball player?" And he said, "Willie Mays." And I said, I don't like him. Who's second best?" And my brother said, "Well, I don't know, second best, maybe Tony Oliva." So I said, "All right, Tony Oliva is now my favorite player." Just based on that conversation, I made Tony Oliva my favorite player. I don't know why I didn't like Willie Mays. I have no idea. But Tony Oliva became my favorite player, and the Twins became my favorite team. And that lasted until I was, I think, 17. And what was it? 1975. Yeah, 1975. I jumped on the Red Sox bandwagon. They had Fred Lynn, Jim Rice. They made the World Series in '75. Yeah. I jumped on the bandwagon and became a Red Sox fan ever since. Plus, then I also went to college in Boston. I actually was a season ticket holder for the Red Sox the last 3 years that I lived in Boston.
It's funny, rooting for the. So I'm going to say, based on what you just said with years and ages, you're probably 2 years older than me. So when you became a Twins fan, they were not a bad team. I mean, they would have spent Billy Martin. Well, he only there 1 year, but around that time.
No, they were good. They had Harmon Killebrew, Rod Carew, Jim Cott. Yeah, they were good. I remember when I went to Fenway a couple of times when I was still before I moved there, and when I was still a Twins fan. I remember Harmon Killebrew hit a home run into the lights, it knocked out some lights in the light tower on the left field line, in just in fair territory. If anybody's been at Fenway Park, those lights are pretty damn high up.
They are. It's funny. I want to move it. We'll move into the fantasy part of this and the baseball part of this in a second. Yeah, I find it interesting that your brother came up with, and Tony Oliva was a fine player, but I find it interesting to think he was the second best player in baseball at the time.
Well, I know it wasn't like a clear choice. He just came up with that. I think he probably had a dozen other guys in mind when he said Tony Oliva.
Yeah.
My brother. I'll give you just a little. A little tidbit about my brother, with a local, Half Moon Schenectady Albany flavor. When my brother was in high school, he had a really good friend from high school. The two of them went to the races at Saratoga almost every night, like the last year or two of high school. And after graduating high school, my brother never went back to the races at Saratoga ever again. But his friend was Mark Casano, who went on to be like the local, big racing reporter for the Time Union or something.
I know the name well. Yeah,
a lot of people up there. Yeah,
that's interesting. Very interesting how where everybody's closer, it seems, than you think. There's that whole 6 degrees of separation thing. There's a lot of that for sure. Let's move on. So. Your interest in baseball is established. You became a Red Sox fan, and still are, I take it? Or by the way, before I go further?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a little bit hard to root for them these days, but
I am a Yankee fan. I won't hold that part against you at all. I try to stay professional on this team and not berate people for their team choices. Just kidding. As you start to get interested in baseball, did you play? And I think we all played, at least in our lifetime. And you can help me with some of the names of the games that we played. Tabletop, before there was fantasy baseball, guys of a certain age, there were games that we played on tabletop. Stratomatic was one of my go-tos. SI had one, and I can never find it listed, but Sports Illustrated had one that all the names were like on a sheet, and they had, it was a dice game. And it was similar to Stratomatic, except you didn't have individual cards. They were laid out. I don't remember that. You might. There was one with a disc that just spun the disc, and there was, if you're a big home run hitter, you had a big number one. If you didn't, you had a tiny one. I don't remember the name of that. What were some of the ones that you played? And again, this is how I learned about players. A lot of times there was no ESPN, there was no what.
Yeah. Right. I played APBA, APBA, which is similar to Stratomatic. They had games for baseball and then football and a couple of other sports. So I played that. There were board games like Pataco Ellis All-Star Baseball, and Frank Layden Scientific Football. When I'll just transition into the book here with this. The book I wrote is called The History of Fantasy Sports.
Yeah.
And there's never been a book written like this before. And I've known for a long time somebody needs to write a book like this because it's like you look at the fantasy sports, and now when you're watching a football game or baseball game, you have all this fantasy information on there. It's a $25 billion worldwide industry. Millions and millions of people play not just fantasy football and fantasy baseball, but you got fantasy Iditarod, fantasy wakeboarding, and fantasy everything. And so I've going back the last several years, I look at this, and I go, where did this come from? I mean, people had ideas for games years ago, and now we got Sirius XM Radio Fantasy. You got all these big companies providing fantasy information, fantasy experts, and it's like, where did this come from? I just thought somebody needs to write a book and explain what happened. So I started out with the idea to write a book called, about the history of fantasy sports.
Yeah.
And so with this topic we're talking about, I know that some people consider like Stratomatic and APBA and games like that a precursor to fantasy sports. In my mind, I thought, well, it sort of is and sort of isn't, because the difference is these board games are based on statistics from prior years, whereas in fantasy sports, it's on statistics that haven't happened yet. When you draft your football team, you don't know what's going to happen yet. So I thought, when I started researching, well, I'll probably just write like 2 or 3 paragraphs mentioning that these games were precursors to fantasy sports. But when I started researching, I found out all this fascinating information about APA and Stratomatic and some other things. And, it's pretty much, like the first chapter is mostly about this.
Yeah.
And one thing is there are people who started leagues for APA and Stratomatic. They've been playing for 50 years. You got a guy who, it's kept their college friends together and things like this. You got a guy who was in an APA league for 40 years, and he developed ALS. And when he had ALS, he thought, and everybody thought, well, he's going to have to stop playing. His wife said, listen, if you want to keep playing, I will do whatever I have to do so you can keep playing. And she would go to every game with him. She'd roll the dice for him and help him out. And he did this for like 3 years or so with ALS. And he got to the point where, he could only communicate through a computer and an eye reader and his wife reading his lips. And in that condition, his team came from 2 runs behind in extra innings to win his first ever APA League World Series championship after being in the league for 40 years. Wow. And everybody broke out into tears. So, cool. It's like, yeah, it is. And so what happened then, I kept researching, other topics like, how did fantasy baseball originate? How did fantasy football originate? Et cetera, et cetera. And as I kept, learning all these amazing things about all these different topics, well, I got the subtitle for the book. The subtitle of the book is, the book is called The History of Fantasy Sports. The subtitle is, And the Stories of the People Who Made It Happen. Because the stories are, fascinating. And so what I realized, Gregor, is to write the history of fantasy sports, I can tell all the facts and figures who did what when, tell the whole story. But it's also going to come off as a very boring research paper.
Right.
But by including all these stories, it's made the book, interesting. I mean, the Midwest Book Review had a reviewer, who doesn't even play fantasy. And, the review said it's fascinating from start to finish. And, the reviews on Amazon and everywhere else are great. People say it's easy to read. It's fascinating. You got people who've been in the fantasy industry their whole life, never even knew most of this information or knew these stories. So it turned out better than I could have imagined.
As we evolved into, and by the way, I have some friends that still play Stratomatic, as you're talking about all these years later. They get together as a group and they still play. I play myself. I don't play the cards anymore. They have an online version that I play. They have mystery tournaments and stuff, so you don't know what year you're going to get on the card. It's kind of fun because you get to manage a little bit, right? So I find it still interesting. Played fantasy sports myself since 1986, as I mentioned earlier. And I was under the misconception for years, as I mentioned, and I'm sure a lot of people are. I think you talk about it in your book, that Dan Okeren and Glenn Wagner and that crew with Rotisserie League Baseball, because they had the first book out that I remember, were kind of the forerunners here, but that's not true. Why don't you talk a little bit about that misconception and how it did get started?
Yeah, okay. But before I do, let me just throw in a couple of quick things more about Stratomatic on what you said. Because Stratomatic, it influenced so many people that are in Major League Baseball, people that are into fantasy, people that are Major League Baseball executives. So Stratomatic ends up being mentioned throughout the book in different ways. And there's a lot of other great stories about Stratomatic, like the Baltimore Orioles, the Orioles announcer at one point, John Miller. They were taking a trip from Baltimore to the West Coast. So he's told somebody to bring your Stratomatic game. So you got on the airplane flying to the West Coast, you got John Miller is playing some other Oriole Stratomatic, and Cal Ripken walks by. He's like, "What are you guys doing?" And Cal Ripken starts playing. It's like some great stories about it. Yeah, and then so getting to your question, there's a myth out there that Dan Okren magically came up with the idea for rotisserie baseball on a flight from Connecticut to Texas. And that's not true. He had actually, it goes back before that, years ago. There were precursors to modern fantasy baseball. There was a kind of a primitive game that Dan Okrent's professor was playing when Dan Okrent was in college in Michigan, and Dan wasn't interested at that time. But there's like a whole story behind it, and a lot of misconceptions. The research, I spent 18 months researching the book, like Googling one thing after another, after another, after another. I interviewed dozens and dozens of people. I interviewed Okrent extensively, among other people. But the thing is, Okrent is the guy who is primarily responsible for creating modern fantasy baseball. It's like what he came up with was kind of like chess compared to what other people had was checkers. And the other thing is, Okrent was a writer, and the people he got into his initial league, they were all like, writers, publishers, editors. And so because of that, when they started, they got publicity, got articles published in the New York Times and whatnot. So it's started to spread. And they wrote a book that you referenced that their first league was in 1980, and then Bantam Books asked them to write a book about it. So in 1984 there was a Bantam book based on their league, and that's you and like thousands of other people were introduced to fantasy baseball and started playing it. Matt Berry, for example, the famous, probably the most famous fantasy analyst, from ESPN and now NBC, when he was like 14 years old, he saw the book, and that's how he got into it when he was 14.
Very interesting story. And these guys, I mean, they wrote the books, but, and I remember there was a 30-30 done on them by ESPN, if I remember right, but they never really were able to cash in. Yeah. And I think they thought they would cash in big, and they made one big strategic mistake, I think, right? What speak a little to that, why they were never able to kind of cash in on that success.
Yeah. Well, the 30-30 was, really not very good. I mean, that's one of the reasons there's this myth that he magically invented the game.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, what happened? They trademarked the name, and they made a little bit of money by, selling things. But the problem was there really wasn't anything to trademark. The rules are so simple. There's nothing you can really trademark or copyright. So what happened is their game was originally called rotisserie baseball. When they had one of their first meetings to finalize the rules, they met in Manhattan at a restaurant called La Rotisserie Française, which I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of that. But,
close enough. I wouldn't.
They named the game after that. They named the game rotisserie baseball after that restaurant. But then, when people started wanting to use it, and they didn't want to pay these guys for a trademark fee, they just changed the name to fantasy baseball. People would realize these guys have nothing of value, so I'm just going to change the name to fantasy baseball, and they can't sue me for trademark infringement. So that's why it ended up kind of going from it started as rotisserie baseball, and then for many years there were people playing rotisserie baseball and other people playing fantasy baseball, and now at some point it became pretty much all fantasy baseball. And meanwhile, a guy named
Go
ahead.
I was just going to say, it's amazing to me that a group. I think we have a delay, so I apologize. A group, and I'll let you continue, but I want to get this in there. It's a group of people that are as bright as these people that started the rotisserie league there weren't smart enough to think, we can't call this because somebody's going to be able to get around this pretty easy. You would think they would have copyrighted other terms as well, like fantasy. That's interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess they didn't think of that, but there's just the problem was there's nothing really to copyright. If they had trademarked a couple of other names like they probably never would have occurred to them like, oh, maybe somebody just call it fantasy, because then they would have just come up with some other name.
Yeah, true.
Meanwhile, fantasy football actually started before that. Fantasy football started in 1963 by a guy named Bill Winkenbach, and in Oakland, and Winkenbach, his initial group of people played this game fantasy football, which was kind of like a primitive version compared to modern fantasy football. They kind of just kept it amongst themselves, and it didn't spread. But one of the guys in their original league, named Andy Musolimus, he ended up buying a bar in Oakland, and or maybe San Francisco, I'm getting myself confused. But he's the guy who started spreading fantasy football, because he thought, it might be fun and good for business if I make this league of this game available to my patrons. So he made it available to his patrons, and there was interest, and they started a league. And the next year grew to 2 leagues, and then 3 leagues. So word of mouth started to spread, and people would start calling from bars, in other areas, asking him for the rules, and he gave people the rules. And so he's the guy primarily responsible for really starting to spread fantasy football. And, back to the stories and the research, like when I got to this part of my research, I couldn't talk to Musolimus because the guy's not alive anymore. But I would Google article after article after article, to the point where, I'm reading the same stuff I've read 20 times before. Yeah. But, every once in a while, there would be this little tidbit that wasn't mentioned before. So I'm doing this with Musolimus, and after like 15, 20 articles, all of a sudden I see something that hadn't been mentioned before, which was the guy was a freaking war hero. When he was 17 years old, Pearl Harbor happened, and he volunteered for the Army for a unit where they're going to go behind enemy lines. And the recruiter said 97% of you are not going to return. And they gave him a cyanide pill so he could kill himself if he got caught. But obviously he made it through, he returned. And so it's like, it's just, I was like, are you kidding me? This guy was a war hero, and these first 20 articles didn't even mention that. He later, when he was like 90 years old, he went to Washington to get the Congressional Medal of Honor. And I think he was like the only surviving member of his unit, or the only one who was survived and also still healthy enough to make the trip to Washington for it.
It's not like they waited way too many years to honor him, for sure, for that service.
Yeah.
Yeah. So from that point, where was the big explosion, right? I mean, again, this was kind of I remember when we started 86 and then 87, and somewhere in the 90s, it feels like this thing exploded. It became not just baseball, but football and then other sports, as you mentioned today. Yeah. There's everything. But what was that jump off point in your mind, Larry, that it just became a national phenomenon? What caused it?
Well, the biggest thing was the internet. I mean, first you had computers. Computers helped a lot, because then you could do statistics by hand. I mean, on a computer. Originally people had to do statistics by hand, so the commissioner of your league would spend 10 hours a week getting all the statistics from the newspaper and figuring out all the standings by hand. So computers helped a lot, where you could start doing the statistics on a computer. But then the internet's when it exploded. The internet made it just so people could play online. They could hear about it. I mean, that's when it exploded, was the internet.
Yeah, it's a great point. I remember our league in the early years, everybody had to come to this bar we all hang around on Wednesday and fill out their stat sheet and give it to the commissioner so he could then put the numbers into the computer, and we have our standings. And the fallacy there was because the waiver wires would be reverse standings order, right? So we had one guy we had to watch like a hawk, because he would manipulate his numbers so he'd be lower in the standings. So the internet kind of changed all that when we had stat services we could rely on. What would you say that started? I mean, late 90s? All-Star Stats was the first week.
80s.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember
All-Star Stats was...
Yeah.
Well, All-Star Stats is mentioned in my book quite a bit, because they were one of the first few really big stat services, and they also ended up becoming what is now Roto World, And the basis of NBC Sports Fantasy all started from All Star Stats. Rich Pike and Mike Olivko started All Star Stats, and I interviewed both of them. And Rich Pike's dad helped them when they started Roto-World. Rich Pike's dad helped them a little bit with Roto-World. And the thing about his dad is now about 92 years old, and he's a huge Shohei Ohtani fan. And he'll stay up, he lives in New York, he'll stay up until 2 a.m. to watch Ohtani's West Coast games. And last year, he won his fantasy league, thanks to Ohtani. I should say thanks to Ohtani, even though Ohtani was out the last month of last year with an injury, he won his fantasy league anyway.
Mm-hmm. It's
there's one of the first.
Yeah.
One of the first fantasy stat services was run by a couple, Jim and Gloria Berger from Pennsylvania. And what you did back then in the 80s, the USA Today would have the American League statistics on Tuesday and the National League statistics on Wednesday. So they get the statistics from there, and they put them in the computer and run all the reports and mail them out to their clients. And one Wednesday, though, Gloria went into labor with her first child. But they did not let a little thing like going into labor stop them from getting the statistics out. So in between contractions, Gloria would read the statistics from the USA Today, and Jim would enter them into the computer. And she'd be like reading statistics, and then say, "Oh, wait, hold on, here comes another one." Okay, it's gone. And she continued the statistics, and they got the report out on time. And now, awesome. 37 years later, their daughter that was born on that day is now in a fantasy football league with her dad.
Well, that's cool. Another cool story. I got to get through the rest of this book. I can't wait to get into it. Hopefully this weekend a bit. It's so we talked about, and you talked about, the internet obviously made this thing grow. I mean, early on, I'm sure people didn't want to get involved because of the work involved, or they were casual fans, still had no interest in it probably until the internet. Where was the first? Where did that first hit on the internet? Who was? I mean, now you can find them everywhere. Obviously, Yahoo, ESPN, MLB. Everybody's got their own fantasy apps. Where was the first one that you could play online?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. There were a few of them. CBS Sports was one of the first one. It was originally Sportsline. Yeah. And then, daily fantasy continued the explosion, when DraftKings and FanDuel daily fantasy sports started, because a lot of people were interested in fantasy, but not it's too much time commitment. Fantasy football's 18 weeks, fantasy baseball 6 months. So there's a lot of people that would like to play fantasy, but that's too much of a time commitment. So daily fantasy made it easy for a lot of other people to play, which helped the just explode even more.
I got to tell you on that topic a little bit. I mean, for 30 plus years, all I played were weekly leagues, auction leagues, which I prefer. Some were dynasty, some weren't. We had one that was same people basically from 86 to 2019, I guess. And I preferred that format, but now there's all kinds of formats. What's your, head to head? You get, which I didn't care for myself. I like the cumulative stat leagues better. What are your preferences? Again, we'll talk a little bit now, I guess, at this point about your own experiences. I know you're obviously not just a writer of this, the history of this, but you're also a very proficient player. What are your preferences as far as baseball itself goes? And tell us about some of your experience.
Well, I've been in auction baseball leagues, and I've been in snake draft and also salary draft. Now, for anybody who doesn't know about fantasy sports, auction means you bring up a player like Shohei Ohtani, and people bid. People have a certain budget to spend on players, and he gets sold. He gets sold to the highest bidder. Every player gets sold to the highest bidder. A snake draft is where you have a draft order, Um, and whoever has the first pick picks somebody, second pick picks whoever they want, deal like that. And salary cap is a format which is used. The daily fantasy sports, for example, have salary cap games where every player is assigned a salary, and you can pick whoever you want, but you have to have a certain number of players, fill out a certain positions, and you have to keep under salary cap. So those are the like three formats, and there's others like you mentioned, head to head. I like, I kind of like all of them for different reasons, and I hate all of them for different reasons.
That's fair.
Options are particularly annoying. Options are really a pain because, like, somebody will bring up Keith Engle, and I'll buy Keith Engle for $15, thinking that's a good deal. But then, 20 minutes later, Larry Schechter comes up and he goes for $13, and I can't afford him because I already bought Keith Engle, and I think, geez, I would have rather had Larry Schechter for 13 and Keith for 15. It's like it's a pain.
It's time consuming because our drafts would be 5 or 6 hours because we were drafted minor league. I think I read or saw an interview with you where you never got into leagues with minor leaguers and dynasty leagues per se, but we'd get into really long sessions. But then guys would also start. We mentioned Ohtani, right? And there's always a guy every guy he throws out at $1. Like, why are you throwing Ohtani out at $1 to start with? Because we don't need to go for $1 to $2 to $5 when we know he's going for 50. So
right, yeah.
For simplicity, I guess the snake drafts are probably the simplest, right?
They're definitely simplest.
Yeah. So you don't have a preference necessarily. I mean, do you prefer like head-to-head against the cumulative category type leagues?
I don't really. I'm not that interested in head-to-head. I've actually never played head-to-head.
Yeah. I only have the last couple of years since we kind of disbanded that league. I told you last it was around for like over 40 years, I guess. Same guys, 40 years. That's pretty impressive too, right? But we disbanded that when you guys got yeah. But I started playing head to head.
There's a lot. There's a lot of leagues that have been around for 30, 40, 50 years with mostly the same guys. It's amazing. I mean, I mentioned several in the book, and I wasn't, even trying to find that out. If somebody wanted to like find out, make a list of leagues that have been going 30, 40, 50 years. You can find a lot of them. I got like a couple dozen without even looking for it. People would just, I contact somebody to interview them about, something they did for fantasy, one of the first fantasy football websites or whatever it was, or one of the first magazines or whatever. And, they mentioned they've been in, their own, home league for 40 years or whatever, still going. The book covers everything from, the first, what we've already mentioned, the precursors, how did fantasy football start, fantasy baseball. It's got the first commercial games, the first websites, first publications, magazines, Fantasy Sports Trade Association, various things like injury experts, and right through daily fantasy and worldwide expansion. There's like 60 million people playing, more than 60 million people playing fantasy sports in the U.S. and Canada. And that doesn't even count like under age 18. You got a lot of people under age 18 who play. And then in India, there are 200 million people playing fantasy cricket in India.
Interesting. I don't think I do very well. I would need to just let the computer draft for me, I guess, in that game.
Yeah, I wasn't saying you should play. I'm just saying you got 200 million people in India playing fantasy cricket. That's pretty amazing. And then the biggest company there that does that, Dream 11, they're worth $8 billion. That company. Wow,
and the money has just gotten so crazy, and it's really the sites that are running the league because they're now all inclusive, right? I'm going to guess there's no real stat services out there because it's all inclusive when you go play at Yahoo or CBS or wherever. So there's no stat services left, right?
Um, well, some of them are. Well, I mean, yeah, there are stat services. I mean, people who have like their own league need to get statistics done somewhere.
Yeah.
So yeah, so some of the,
I wa-
some of them are all, some of them are all, yeah, I mean, some of them are all inclusive. Like if you join a Yahoo League or whatever, or you might sign up to play a game on some company where they also do the stats. But yeah, but they're like, for example, I'm in a league where the stats are done a company RT Sports. Now RT Sports also offers their own games. You could go to RT Sports, you could sign up for a league, or you could take you and your 10 friends or whatever that have your own league and have them do your stats for you.
It's interesting. I would have assumed, I guess, that everybody had migrated to online leagues like we had at some point. And I guess that's not accurate.
Yeah.
Rick,
Yeah, I see
Rick,
a I just noticed a comment from Rick. Says fantasy football is way less work than fantasy baseball. Yeah, fantasy baseball is it's a grind. It's every day. It's like, I mean, because I mean they're baseball games every day. It is a grind. Now, one thing I've never done and never will do. Most fantasy baseball leagues have weekly transactions. There are some where you have daily transactions. You can move players every single day.
right.
I have no interest in that because making moves for fantasy baseball once a week is plenty enough. But daily, give me a break.
That's the leagues that I'm in.
Some people like it.
It's hard.
Yeah.
I miss guys in the lineup all the time because it's daily. Some days just get away from me and you can't do it. I prefer the weekly much so myself. So. Rick did mention here that I would probably do better in the cricket leagues than I'm doing right now in the fantasy leagues that he participates with me in. So he's probably right. I probably ought to drop out of all the baseball leagues I'm in now and get into cricket. I think maybe I will. You, though, on the other hand, you played in some pretty prestigious leagues and won them. Tell us a little bit about your history playing the game, Larry. Don't be shy.
Well, when I started, I was in one of the first big, commercial games was CDM Sports out of St. Louis, and I was in I played their baseball and football. So they had you would be in a league and you could win the league, and then they had overall competition with everybody. And in 2002, I won their overall competition with something like 15,000 people or whatever it was. And then in 2005, I won it again. So I was the first person to win their overall competition twice. And that ended up when I won it in 2005, there's a fantasy baseball experts league called LABR, LABR, run by the USA Today. And they had a deal set up with CDM for a couple of years back then, where the winner of CDM would get to be in next year's LABR. So in 2005, when I won it, I got to be in LABR in 2006. And then I ended up hooking up with one of the fantasy companies, Sandlot Shrink, and I represented them in LABR after that. So I ended up getting to be in LABR, and a few years later, I was invited to join the other big experts league, which is called Tout Wars. And so I've been in LABR and Tout Wars for like 20 years or so. I won LABR 3 times. So I won Tout Wars 6 times.
Not to get you in trouble with the IRS or anything, but would you consider yourself a professional fantasy player at that time? Were you making money doing that?
The IRS can listen to this conversation. LABR and Tout Wars LABR and Tout Wars, there's no money involved at all. So it's just for bragging rights or whatever. And when I won CDM in 2002, 2005, the grand prize for the overall winner, like 15,000 teams, was $25,000.
Well,
so it's not like today where if you did that, you might win $1 million.
Yeah. It's kind of hard to hide it today because there's not a guy giving me an envelope.
I believe I paid my taxes, but I think it's probably past the statute of limitations. So IRS In your face. No, I'm kidding. I'm sure I paid my taxes.
I like that sentiment, though, with the IRS, so that's fine. So back, I guess, to your first book, the How to Win at Fantasy Baseball. Again, if I got that name right, I apologize. When did you write that book? After you had started to have this success in these leagues?
Yeah, that was in 2014. I had the success. I was, regarded as one of the best fantasy baseball players, and I decided, I'm just going to write a book about my strategy. So that book explains my entire strategy from beginning to end. It's kind of like if somebody never played fantasy baseball before, they could read that and know what to do, like the entire thing. The whole process from projecting players to to drafts and whatnot. And that book, if somebody wants to improve their skills for playing fantasy baseball, it's a good book to read. Also, a lot of it applies to fantasy football or any other sport. But that's kind of like a limited appeal. Whereas my current book, The History of Fantasy Sports, I'll say anybody who plays fantasy sports should read this book. You'll love it. The reviews are fantastic. Even people who don't play fantasy who liked it because the stories are so interesting. Also makes a great gift for anybody. If you know somebody who plays fantasy football or other fantasy sports, it makes a great gift.
I'll buy you one, Rick, since while you're busting my chops about our finish this year, I did beat you in the playoffs, so I avoided last place. Just want to say that. So good even there, Rick. One thing I want to touch on with you here, Larry, is the way fantasy, and this is one of my problems with fantasy sports. For me, I don't watch sports any different, right? I don't go and root for certain players. I let the stats come in, and then I do what I have to do. But for a whole generation, I think, or maybe more, it's changed the way people watch sports. And I don't know if it's for the better or not. I mean, as a sports fan yourself, I mean, how do you feel about the way, and maybe I'm wrong in my perception, but my perception is younger people watch games much differently than I did or do because of fantasy sports.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that it takes some of the emphasis off of rooting for your team. For myself, I'm more interested usually in my rooting for my fantasy team than, the Red Sox or somebody. On the other hand, it makes you much more aware of all the teams and players. You got, some meaningless game, like, if the Indians are playing the White Sox in some meaningless game, where, most people aren't going to be watching, but if you have a couple of players on your fantasy team, you're going to watch. And this is another thing, in my book is the whole kind of history of how this evolved, where when fantasy sports first started, most people had no idea what it was. And then, initially there was a lot of resistance to it from the leagues and, baseball writers and whatnot. In fact, when Oakland started playing in 1980, and then people started to learn about it, within like a year or two, there were actually at the time, rotisserie baseball leagues in every press box in Major League Baseball. The writers heard about it, started their own leagues. So you had a bunch of baseball writers forming their own leagues and playing, but then you had other baseball writers who said, this is horrible. This is going to ruin the game. This is for, stat geeks, and people aren't going to root for the team anymore. And the professional sports and players associations were resistant to it. But over a period of time, they finally, the NFL Players Association, et cetera, they finally figured out that people playing, fantasy sports they're watching a lot more games than the average fan. They're buying more merchandise. They're buying the key packages. It took them a long time to finally realize fantasy was actually good for them.
Yeah.
And now of course they're totally on board. Offering their own games and mentioning fantasy everywhere.
Yeah, like I said, I've had this struggle, I think, throughout my life. In fact, early on, that one league I mentioned to you that was 40-some years we played, it was a National League only league, and I got in it specifically because I never wanted to root against the Yankees or have the Yankees out of their teams. So I got into a National League only league for that specific reason. And I'm sure we still have American, and maybe we don't. I'm assuming you can still play one or the other. And not just all of baseball, which all of baseball just seems too easy to me. I don't know. It just seems too easy. But maybe that's just my opinion. Also, and again, I don't know how these two things are related, Larry, and maybe you touch on it in the book, or you can elaborate here at least. The game has moved away from the historic numbers. When we started playing fantasy leagues in baseball anyway, it was the counting stats that really mattered, right? And as baseball has changed and we look at all these different metrics, a lot of them have been incorporated into fantasy sports, and it's kind of a chicken or the egg thing for me. I don't know whether fantasy sports helps create this dichotomy in baseball or vice versa, but I'm still the historical counting numbers still matter to me rather than some of these. There's important things we maybe didn't use. OPS is a good stat, right? WHIP is a good stat. In fact, I think we use those from the beginning, or at least WHIP we use from the beginning. What are your thoughts on the way baseball players are looked at from a metric standpoint rather than just the counting numbers that we thought were so important for, 150 years?
Yeah. Well, I'll start by saying, an interesting little tidbit about how some of this all works together. Dan Okrent played Stratomatic before he came up with Rotisserie Baseball. Dan Okrent played Stratomatic. Dan Okrent is the guy who invented WHIP, and he invented WHIP based on some stuff he learned from Stratomatic. So it's interesting how a lot of this stuff ties together. And then, Bill James, and there's a chapter in my book about advanced analytics, and Bill James was the guy who really started it all. But Bill James was looking at it from the perspective of analyzing Major League Baseball players' performance, and not from any kind of fantasy angle. But James started analytics, and other people picked up on it. Ron Chandler is one person. He's one of maybe the first person who really started combining advanced analytics with fantasy baseball. And Chandler created a company called Baseball HQ. He puts out a book called The Baseball Forecaster. And then other people, kind of picked up on it. You got Baseball Prospectus does a lot of work with it, Fangraphs. A guy named Aaron Schatz is the one who really started it a lot for fantasy football, doing analytics for football and incorporating them into fantasy football strategy, or for evaluating players for fantasy football. And then people started doing it for hockey and basketball, and here we are.
It's amazing what this is.
So so it's good. The analytics are good for real Major League Baseball teams or football teams, evaluating their players, and they're also good for fantasy players trying to evaluate what players are going to do. And then you got the other aspect of analytics. As if you watched the football game last night, the Giants have 4th and 3 on the 40 or whatever they've got. It's like maybe 5 years ago they would have punted for sure, but now it's like, well, the analytics say you should go for it.
That's a good point. Well, the analytics says you should never kick an extra point. You should always go for 2 as well. So team situations got to play into those things, though, sometimes, right? So it's very interesting. Again, I think the first fantasy league I get in that counts exit velocity as a category, I may have to finally give up the game, I guess, to take it to an extreme.
Yeah.
Let's see. There was one question I missed here. I want to get you some final thoughts from you. And I guess this plays into fantasy sports a little bit. But you growing up in Schenectady, who's the best player to come out of Schenectady? I know the most well-known name I think is John Tudor was from Schenectady, and Billy Connors was a coach for a long time. Are you aware of any other name players that we would know that came out of Schenectady or the area?
Not that I'm aware of. I remember Billy Connors was when the Schenectady won the Little League World Series, right?
Yeah, he did. Yeah. Actually, I just became aware of John Tudor coming from Schenectady recently.
I didn't know that. All I know is for basketball, it'll be Pat Riley.
Oh, sure.
But I don't know about baseball. Yeah.
There was some good player. I mean, Gary Tuck.
Pat Riley went to Lynn.
Yeah, Gary Tuck, who was a coach for the Yankees for years. He was from Amsterdam, New York. I know that. I know there's been some good players from around the area, but Schenectady itself, not really sure. Right? Pat Riley and Barry Kramer were the big names in the Schenectady area, right?
Yeah, Barry Kramer.
Yeah. So.
Yep.
Larry, before we let you go, what are the last thoughts, stuff we didn't touch on that you want to make sure that you share with the audience today? It's been a very interesting hour in getting this. I do recommend a book, and I will get it posted to the website. And it'll be in for all the groups. It'll be in the description of the show. So click on it and buy it. But what do you want to leave us with this morning, Larry?
Well, I'd say the book is available in both paperback and ebook. If Amazon, is probably the easiest. And if you want to see any more details or lots of reviews, they're all on Amazon. But it's also available most major booksellers' websites or even independent stores on their websites. Most of them you can get it again paperback or ebook. Excellent. And if you like fantasy sports, you're going to love it. If you know somebody who likes fantasy sports, it's a great gift to get them.
Well, the little bit I've read, and it's an easy read, so I expect to be through this book this weekend. So I love this type of thing, and I can recommend it just from the little bit I've read so far, and I'll give you a further review as we go forward. Larry, I want to thank you guys. I want to thank everybody who's joined me. Stick around for a second, Larry, and I'll say a proper goodbye. Guys, thanks for participating this morning, and thank you to all the groups that will watch this later. Sunday with the Stream of Consciousness. We'll be on Friday, next Wednesday with the. Oh, next Wednesday I'm busy, so we'll have to reschedule the college football huddle, but I'll let you know about that. And my guest next Friday will be Byron Williams, former Giant, Eagle, and current very important person in the NFL Players Association. We got a lot to talk to Byron about based on some conversation we've had with some retired NFL players. So, guys, thanks for joining me. We'll see you next week with Keith Engle one-on-one. Bye-bye.
You're listening to Keith Engle, the host of TGI Sports Talk on the National Streaming Sports